grade student gets out of their desk and walks around the room without permission. Teacher gives the fourth grader detention. Detention functions as what? This is a great question because it's a good teaching question. We can learn a lot from this question. Obviously, it's some sort of punishment or reinforcement question. It's a consequence question. Consequences do what? Well, they follow a response, and typically they increase or decrease behavior. If they're increasing behavior, it's reinforcement. If they're decreasing behavior, it's punishment. Now, how do we determine if something is a reinforcer or a punisher? Well, we have to look at future behavior. If the consequence doesn't impact future behavior, we cannot for sure say it was reinforcing or punishing. So given this question, where this fourth grade student is getting out of their desk, walking around the room, and then getting detention, do we know what happens to the fourth grader's behavior as a result of detention? We don't. All we know is that the teacher gave them detention. What if the student likes detention because he gets to hang out with his friends, or he gets to avoid going home? There's a million reasons why he might enjoy detention, and detention could function as a reinforcer. Traditionally, detention is a punisher. However, we don't know. The only way we can know for sure whether a consequence is a reinforcer or a punisher is by looking at how behavior changes as a result of that consequence. Therefore, detention functions as what? Is it a positive punisher, a negative punisher, or negative reinforcement? Well, we cannot determine. We don't know what happens to this getting out of the desk behavior as a result of detention. If the question had said the fourth grade student no longer gets out of their desk, it would be a punishment, but it doesn't say that. It only tells us the consequence and not the result of the consequence. Therefore, detention functions as what? It's D, cannot determine. You can learn a lot from this question. Make sure you understand it, especially if you're new to studying, okay? There's a lot to be learned from this particular question. This type of measurement records the number of times a behavior of interest occurs. Again, slightly tricky question. Now, if we just read this, if we were to try to predict the answer choices, which we should when we're studying, what type of measurement would record the number of times a behavior occurs? Well, immediately you should think frequency, because frequency is simply a count of how many times behavior occurs. However, if we look at our answer choices, we don't have frequency. We have duration, we have event recording, we have latency, and we have rate. Now, duration does what? Duration measures how long something occurs for, which is not number of times. Latency records the time in between an SD and a response, not number of times. And rate has a frequency component, but it also has a time component. And all we're doing here is counting how many times a behavior occurs. So we know it's not duration, it's not latency, it's not rate. It has to be event recording. An event recording is just a type of direct recording typically used during a direct assessment where we're counting how many times a behavior occurs. Event recording is essentially the same thing as frequency. So if you see event recording, immediately start thinking frequency, start thinking counting how many times a behavior occurs. So the type of measurement that records the number of times a behavior of interest occurs is called event recording. A client of yours just started using words to make requests. She will say things like food and bathroom. However, your client often speaks too loudly when using these words. Loudly is describing what? Very important here to understand what the question is asking. And that goes for every single question on the exam. Don't get to your answer choices until you for sure understand what the question is asking. So what is this question asking? The question is asking about loudly, what it's describing. So let's look. Let's go back through it. So we know our client is making requests with words. She's saying things like food and bathroom, which is great. However, the client speaks too loudly. So loudly is describing what? Well, loudly is describing the way she says these words. Now, loudly describing the words, is that describing the function? Well, no, function is why it occurred, right? Attention, tangible, escape, automatic. We're not looking at the function when we're talking about loudly. What about topography? Topography is how the behavior looks. So saying food is kind of like topography, right? Loudly does not describe how the behavior looks. It describes the intensity of the behavior. Loudly, softly, big, small, All these things are describing intensity, okay? And when we talk about intensity, specifically loudly and softly, we're talking about magnitude. This is the magnitude of the behavior. The magnitude of the behavior is too much. We need to reduce the magnitude. If we were to put an order, importance of defining a behavior, function would be number 1, of course, it's why it happens. Topography would be number 2, what it looks like. But if we can get magnitude as well, just more information, okay? We know, for example, our client is aggressive. It looks like him hitting somebody with a closed fist. Well, tell me, how hard is it, right? Let's give magnitude as well. Remember, the more complete, clear, and concise we can be, the better. So if we're describing how loudly our client speaks or how softly our client speaks, we're describing magnitude or intensity. We want to measure how often a client attempts to run out of the clinic. We graphed our data. Running would go where? Graphing question. Never panic. I don't do a lot of graphing questions as much as I used to because I don't think they're very hard. If you have my study guide, if you have my practice exams, it's more than enough, right? We also have videos on graphing. They're just not very hard, okay? Because there's only so many questions they can really ask you about graphing as an RBT. As long as you know what a line graph is and the different components of the line graph, you're going to be A-okay, okay? In this case, we want to measure how often a client attempts to run out of the clinic. That's our behavior. So we're going to graph our data. Now, running, which is our behavior, goes where? And this is what I mean knowing the different parts of the line graph. Line graphs have an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis is horizontal. The y-axis is vertical. The x-axis typically shows the passing of time, so hours, minutes, sessions. The y-axis, the vertical axis, typically shows the behavior. So if our behavior is running, where's that behavior going to go? A, horizontal axis. Well, the horizontal axis we just said is the x-axis, which shows passage of time. B, vertical axis. Vertical axis, also known as the y-axis, okay, or the ordinate. Therefore, behavior goes where? On the vertical axis. C, x-axis is just the horizontal axis. We've already eliminated it. D, baseline axis is not a thing. Baseline is a thing, but not a baseline axis. So if we want to graph our data, running or any other behavior is typically going to go on the vertical axis or the y-axis, or also known as the ordinate. So if we graphed our data, running would go on the vertical axis. Motivating operations have 2 effects on behavior. They are what? Very precise and technical question, essentially a definition question. But remember, we're learning. This is practice. This is why we practice. So motivating operation does what? Motivating operation essentially makes you want something or not want something. Okay, it makes you want the consequence, not want the consequence. Motivating operation is an antecedent. It comes before our discriminative stimuli, or SD. It comes before our prompt. It comes before our response. Okay, consequence follows the response. So MOs and SDs kind of go hand in hand, but they are different. The SD says something is available or not available. The motivating operation makes you want or not want. Now, how does the motivating operation affect the consequence? A, value altering and behavior altering. Does the motivating operation alter the value of a consequence? Absolutely. That's the whole point. It either increases or decreases the value of a consequence. Can motivating operations alter behavior? Again, 100%. If you are hungry due to a motivating operation, your food-seeking behavior is going to be altered temporarily. Motivating operations alter value, and they alter behavior. What about B, value altering and topography altering? Well, they alter value, but they do not alter topography. They don't have anything to do with the topography of the consequence or the behavior. C, behavior altering, yes, and topography altering, no. D, only value altering, no. Motivating operations do 2 things. They alter the consequence and they alter behavior. Now, the way this question is worded is a little confusing because it has 2 effects on behavior. They don't alter the value of behavior, but they alter the value of a consequence, okay? So motivating operations have 2 effects, essentially. Value altering and behavior altering. When is an RBT allowed to share confidential information? Get good at identifying ethics questions so you can kind of start shaping your thought process with ethics questions because you kind of have to flip a switch, right? Now we're in ethics mode. Ethically, when should we share confidential information? Remember, we have to protect privacy and dignity and rights of all our clients. So A, under the direction of their supervisor. If your supervisor asks you to share confidential information, all you can do is assume they're telling you something accurate. So you are allowed to share confidential information as long as your supervisor tells you. B, protecting the client from harm. If you need to talk to CPS or a teacher or a principal or another, whatever, as long as you're protecting the client from harm, which is our first priority, sharing confidential information is okay. And then C, in accordance with the law. If you're asked by a judge, by a police officer, by a social worker, if the law says you have to share information, go ahead and do it. So when is an RBT allowed to share confidential information? A, under the direction of the supervisor. B, protecting the client from harm. And C, in accordance with law, which leaves us with D, all the above. Your client loves to play video games. Whenever he gets home from school, he hides his backpack and immediately goes to play video games while his parents look for his backpack. How would parents put the hiding of the backpack on extinction? So putting the hiding of the backpack on extinction. And how do we put a behavior on extinction? We withhold reinforcement. Extinction is not punishment. We are withholding reinforcement. We have to determine what is reinforcing and maintaining hiding the backpack. Well, let's look. Whenever he gets home from school, he hides his backpack and goes to play video games, okay, while his parents look for his backpack. So either, right, we don't allow him to play video games or his parents don't look for his backpack, okay? So A, provide praise when the son does not hide his backpack. That's not extinction. That's an attempt at reinforcement. Remember, answer the question given. We're looking for putting the backpack on extinction, which leads to him playing video games while his parents look for his backpack. B, withhold video games when he hides his backpack. Yes, he's getting access to this tangible, this video game. If we're going to put on the behavior on extinction, we need to withhold that reinforcement. So we need to withhold video games as he hides his backpack. What about C, reprimand him for hiding his backpack? Well, that's an attempt at punishment. D, take away the backpack altogether. Now you're just response blocking. Response blocking is not extinction. We have to give them an opportunity to engage to put the behavior on extinction. Always read all of your answer choices and pick the best one. In this case, how are we going to put the hiding of the backpack on extinction? Well, B, we're going to withhold video games when he hides his backpack. That's what appears to be maintaining the behavior. Pick the correct visual representation of latency if the arrow indicates latency. So latency is what? Latency says we are looking for the time in between the SD and the response. So if the arrow is latency, A would be what? Response 1 or response 2 would be into response time, time between responses. B, response 2, response 3 would be into response time, time between responses. C, response 1 to SD, nothing. D, SD, response 1. So time in between SD and response 1 is latency. Pick the correct visual representation of latency. BD, SD to response 1. Finally, during session, a parent asked to be trained on an extinction procedure the BCBA just introduced. As an RBT, how should you respond? Okay, another ethics question, a role question. What is your role as the RBT? To implement, first and foremost, collect data, manage behaviors. Do you parent train without permission? You do not. You do not parent train at all without permission, especially on your own. In this case, you're running a session. The parent asks you to be trained on an extinction procedure the BCBA just introduced. How do you respond? A, train the parent on extinction if you understand how to implement it. Even if you do understand it, even if you think you understand it, we still don't train as RBTs by ourselves without permission. Maybe you think you understand it, but you don't. You can cause harm. B, refuse to train the parent and don't mention it to your BCBA. Well, don't do that. You can refuse to train the parent, that's fine, but not mentioning it to your BCBA, the parent needs to be trained, right? So we have to have that open, honest communication with our supervisors. C, leave the case due to a dual relationship. No, the parent just wants to be trained. There's nothing wrong with that. You've done nothing wrong. D, inform your BCBA and ask how you should proceed. Yes. Tell your BCBA, parent, They've asked to be trained. What do you want me to do? Sometimes the BCBA will say, well, go ahead and train them. Sometimes the BCBA will say, well, I'll go ahead and train them. Either way, you've done the right thing. Question is presented to you as an RBT. Pass it to your supervisor. Go from there.